U.S. British imperial system that's been in place for 300 years, the capital structures that have been in place for 300 years that are now crashing down. And that when they lash out with 9/11, it's to save that. There's also the other related question of world military superiority, that is strategic domination in the military sphere that's at stake. When you see great powers grabbing oil, the first conclusion you have to draw is that you may be on the eve of a new world war. And I think that is the conclusion we have to draw today.
Webster, I see you have a new book out entitled 9/11 Synthetic Terror. You have an entire chapter, I believe, on anthrax. Now, what do you address in that chapter? Do you talk about bio-warfare?
Sure.
What is that about?
The thing about the anthrax is that 9/11, the Pentagon and the World Trade Center towers are far away from rural America, the Midwest. There are large parts of the United States, many people who could say, well, as long as it's skyscrapers, there are no skyscrapers here. And, there are tens of millions of people who felt that they were not on the hook. But, of course, the one thing just about everybody does is go to a post office box or a mail slot at home or your mailbox and get out your daily mail. And as you remember, right, when you did this, you were always thinking how many anthrax spores are in this envelope. And every unidentified piece of junk mail you opened up, you wondered if you were going to get white powder in it. So this was very effective Psy-war. It was also used very consciously by the FBI to take investigators who were supposedly looking into 9/11 and to divert them to something completely different. It's very interesting that the FBI has never solved this crime. I think it's a key to the bankruptcy of their investigative procedures in general, if that were still needed. The one thing that's clear is that the anthrax spores that are involved here come from U.S. military labs. Now, there was a big attempt to point out the inevitable lone assassin in this case, and a man by the name of Hatfield, I guess, was widely targeted, and not so much by name, but by profile. And the notion that he was some kind of a disgruntled loner who had been in Rhodesia, I guess, and probably a racist, and a lot of bad things that could be said about this guy. But as soon as we get the disgruntled loner, we immediately have to be suspicious, because this is the Oswald profile. This is what we've seen again and again and again when the scope of the operation requires a network. And I would therefore say that what's behind the anthrax is a network of highly witting intelligence officials with biological warfare capabilities who simply make this happen. And they leave some false trails that lead to this man Hatfield. And then they put on a kind of a show of going up. I live near this place, right? This is about 30 miles from where I live. They go up to Frederick, Maryland, and start draining ponds in the summer of 2003, I guess it is, if not earlier, to try to find where he assembled these things underwater so that he wouldn't get the spores on him. So this is all crazy. In other words, this is all a kind of a dog and pony show, a spectacle that's put on, and we're left with the certitude that these spores come from a U.S. government lab. So that, I think, speaks volumes about the whole thing. And the guy that they've targeted is, as far as I can see, a scapegoat or a patsy or somehow somebody who could not have done it, didn't have the physical, technical ability to bring it about, in the same way that Oswald couldn't have done it, and in the same way that Atta, however monstrous his criminal intent, could not have done it, didn't have the ability.
Didn't they trace the anthrax right up to the gates of Fort Detrick?
Right, that's the one. Fort Detrick, Maryland, in Frederick. That's where it was. The other thing about it is that at a certain point in the investigation, the FBI authorizes the destruction of a sample, of a bank of anthrax samples held at a university in the South, I think in Louisiana, right in the middle of the whole thing. And then we're asked to believe that the poor FBI agents are overworked and overwhelmed, and they don't really know enough about biological warfare, so they thought it was fine to destroy all the samples that would have made it even more specific in terms of exactly who had the spores in their hands. So this was fundamental as an element of the cover-up. And of course, moles carry out the cover-up.
Yes, I believe that destruction took place right before the investigation traced it there. And wasn't it Ames strain?
Yes, I guess that's the one. And I have the details in here. But I think the main political point is it comes from a U.S. government lab, and the FBI is actively on the scene destroying evidence. We have so many references to the FBI confiscating evidence, destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, that the FBI becomes the black hole of 9/11 evidence. And you can judge the Kane-Hamilton Commission. Governor Kane said at one point that the FBI failed and failed and failed and failed and failed, but he failed to recommend the breakup of the FBI, which would have been the only conceivable response to a failure of this magnitude. He didn't do that, so that's his notion of intelligence reform.
Let's talk a little bit about economics. I know you have a whole chapter called The Catastrophe of Globalization. You've written quite a bit in this book about a looming global economic crisis. Isn't that right?
Yes, absolutely. Here I have an interesting chart. I've tried to summarize the financial crises and panics with the capability of bringing on systemic breakdown. In other words, the collapse of the world banking system and capital flows since 1987, and I guess I have 21 of them. So all during the 1990s, as globalization was being carried out, you have two things going on. One is that all the energy of this system has to be devoted to overcoming these systemic crises. Dollar crises, the Mexican bankruptcy, the Japanese banking crisis, the Southeast Asian crisis, Indonesia on the brink, and then perhaps most significant, September 1998, September 23rd, the long-term capital management crisis, which was a product of the Russian state bankruptcy. This brought the entire world banking system to the verge of breakdown. The clearinghouse interbank payment system in New York jammed up. They couldn't settle among the banks at the end of the day. Similar things were going on in London, and that's when Greenspan had to come in with a kind of a backdoor bailout. We've got Argentina going to default, the J.P. Morgan Chase derivatives monster growing and then imploding. So this is an amazing catalog of instability. So we've got a completely unstable world monetary system. It just doesn't work. This privatized central banking and everything else. At the same time, the immiseration of the world is growing. My estimate would be 2 billion people under $1 a day. You've got 40,000 people dying per day of starvation and diseases like diarrhea that can be cured, or malaria that can be treated at least or prevented with mosquito nets, very cheap things, the sorts of things that, a couple of dollars would save your life from. 40,000 per day die of this. Really, the headline of every newspaper in the world ought to be 40,000 people died needlessly yesterday. And this is going on every day. And you can go on, right? 60% of the people in the world have not made a phone call ever in their lives. 1 billion people are unemployed. Hundreds of millions don't have housing or clean water, and so forth. So globalization has simply been a disaster. Now, where we get to the 9/11 connection, I guess, is the dollar and the euro. Now, maybe you follow me into this. Monetary matters, monetary reform, world monetary system it's a much neglected topic, but I think an important one. You got to remember, the dollar has the status of being a residual reserve currency. It was under Bretton Woods, and it still is. Posted price of oil and other raw materials is in dollars. The main IMF, World Bank, international lending institutions work in dollars. Most of world trade, or at least a lot of it, is still financed through dollar bills of exchange through the London euro-dollar market. So the dollar is the thing, but it's losing out because of the inherent bankruptcy of the U.S. system. Here you have the dollar, supposed to be a world currency, and you're running a $500 or $600 or $750 billion budget deficit. It's actually $750 billion budget deficit right now if you count the Social Security money that's stolen or at least appropriated every year. And you've also got, probably more serious, a $750 billion per year trade deficit. That's with the outside world that you can't control. On your internal front, it's bad, but you can probably control it. but it's the international trade deficit that is really hurting.